Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you. This is Lawton Online on the Rebel.media. And I'm Andrew Lawton, of course, and it is such a pleasure to have you sitting across the table, sitting in front of your computer, listening to me in the earbuds while you drive down a highway or a country road, wherever you're listening. I'm so glad you're here. We've got a great show up ahead for you today, Rebels. We actually are going to be talking later on in the program with Troy Lanigan, president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. On the heels of that organization's 25th anniversary, we'll be talking about the fight for advocacy for taxpayers, past and present, chronicled in a new book by Mr. Lanigan. We'll be discussing that later on in the podcast. We're also going to be talking about rape culture, which I've addressed in a couple of episodes in the past. It has a face, however, at Columbia University, which reached a bit of a head this week, a so-called art demonstration in which a student drags a mattress around campus trying to blame the school for not acting on something that has never been proven. We'll be talking about that later on. I'm going to talk a little bit about weapons and firearms and guns and this sense of fear that seems to exist around things that look scary or look like they might be scary, or things that might look specifically like they're not scary, but still the nanny state has to have its say there. And that actually dovetails perfectly on something I'm going to be talking about right now, which is rather shocking comments made Wednesday of this week by the mayor of Hamilton. Now, I'm not from Hamilton, and I'm pretty sure that I've never met anyone who lived in Hamilton that liked it. I met lots of people that are from Hamilton, lots of people that live and leave Hamilton, but for me, my experience there is mostly related to driving through, and I did have my heart broken by a girl from Hamilton once, so maybe that's part of the bias that I have. But the mayor of Hamilton this week had to respond in a city council meeting to something that happened last weekend. As the mayor, he was not happy to know that there was a brazen midday shooting last weekend. As of the time of this recording, the suspects have not yet been caught. Two men were shooting at each other, caught on surveillance cameras. Two young black men, dark hair, tall, slim build. It may have been two people that happened to be guns that didn't like each other. It may have been gang-related. I am not going to speculate, but I will say that it's a bit of, I'd say, an anomaly. Most cities in Canada don't have rampant gun crime, midday shootouts, all the less. Yet still, it happened. And what happened in Hamilton's council meeting this week is almost scarier, in a way, knowing that the gunfight didn't shoot anyone, or didn't kill anyone, rather, than what happened this weekend. The mayor of Hamilton, Fred Eisenberger, said that because of this, the city should ban guns. Ban guns, those are his words, not mine. It's shocking, actually. He said, quote, "I think we should really try to ban guns in this city. I don't know if we can do it. I haven't fleshed out the constitutional issues." By the way, I love that now, lawmakers go with let's just pass the law and figure out the constitutional implications later. This is the Hamilton, Ontario equivalent of Nancy Pelosi's "you have to pass the bill to find out what's in it" statement. He also questioned why a reasonable person would even want to carry a gun. But this is the shocking line. He said, quote, "We can't stop idiots from being idiots. I want to know if we can stop them from having guns." Unquote. He said that it's troubling to have people standing on the street shooting at one another. He said that it's something that needs to be nipped in the bud. He said, quote, "I can't think of any reason anyone in our city would need a gun." Unquote. He doubled down on that a few moments later, said other than police, he doesn't know why anyone should have the ability to own a gun. And he explicitly said, "I want to know if we can stop them." Now, the chair of the Police Services Board said his comments came out of left field. He said he understands why there's a desperation to do things. There was even an old Wild West reference there. I'm not sure that applies when you have one incident of gun crime. And yes, there have been a couple others, but it's not like Hamilton has turned into a city like, Chicago, which, by the way, has tried the gun ban and found that gun crime actually increased, funny enough. And if you head on over to the Megaphone, the blog on the Rebel.media, edited by my friend Rick McGinnis, you'll see a piece I wrote this week about this comment by Mayor Eisenberger. And I wrote that he seems to be unsatisfied with the bans already at his disposal and at the disposal of the police in Hamilton and any other city, jurisdiction, province, or even nationwide in this country. This is what I wrote. The aforementioned Hamilton gunfight featured two men shooting at each other with handguns, firearms that are either restricted or prohibited under Canada's firearms laws. Let's recap a few bans already in effect, shall we? Canada essentially has a ban on carrying a loaded weapon, which, unless you have a rare concealed carry permit or are a police officer, you can't have one. Canada has a ban on transporting a restricted weapon or prohibited, not in a locked case with ammunition stored separately. Canada has a ban on transporting a restricted weapon without an authorization to transport, which is a permit that allows gun owners to move their gun from their home to a gun range or gunsmith and back with no route deviation. Canada has a ban on pointing guns at people, even fake guns, by the way, which we'll be talking about in a future segment on this episode. And most importantly, Canada has a ban on shooting people, as well as trying to kill them, trying to hurt them, trying to scare them, etc. Regardless of your motivation, it's illegal to shoot someone. So we already have, based on my rudimentary knowledge of Canadian law, 5 things that have been banned. 6 if the shooters didn't have valid possession and acquisition licenses, restricted possession and acquisition licenses, which I may be wrong. I would venture a guess to say they probably don't. So potentially 6 laws, 5 at least, maybe a few more, that have been broken before the first bullet was even fired. Now, why does the mayor of Hamilton not think that these bans were effective? Well, we know they weren't. We saw the video footage. We saw the surveillance footage of this gunfight taking place. But the mayor of Hamilton is unsatisfied on many counts, specifically with Canada's already long-standing ban on murder. Just as every time there's been a school shooting, Virginia Tech for that matter, it seemed as though the fact that the school was a designated gun-free zone had little bearing, no impact, as a matter of fact, on the actual crime itself and the mentality of the criminal. And I know to some extent I'm preaching to the choir here. We all know the reality that is now a little more than a trope, even though the left and the mainstream media haven't embraced it. We know that guns don't kill people without a person who wants to kill or a person who is ill-equipped to handle a gun. And that's why in Canada, despite the fact that I'm an opponent of a lot of gun control moves, I think our system in Canada is effective. I'm not saying I like the way it is, but having a license, of which I recently became privy to, is a good way to weed out certain people that probably shouldn't have guns. People with criminal records, for example, people with mental illnesses, etc. I think maybe we are a little bit too, dare I say, conservative on how we allow gun ownership. But I think once you've determined that you are entitled and authorized to own a firearm, I think a lot of the restrictions we have are a bit ridiculous. These arbitrary designations between restricted and prohibited weapons, the fact that the RCMP can, without parliamentary approval, decide overnight to make a gun, regardless of the reason, regardless of this, if there's a need for it, illegal, forcing law-abiding citizens to surrender their property. We saw this with Swiss Arms a couple of years ago, for example, without getting any compensation, at the risk of becoming overnight criminals. And then you have things like the authorization to transport. I mentioned that a few moments ago, things that prevent people only on paper from taking a gun to a shopping mall, to a sports field, etc. despite the fact that if someone wants to deviate from their course, there's no tracker in their car that prevents them from doing it. And it's interesting because I remember going back several months now when the Conservatives were putting forth their common sense reforms to firearms. I can't remember the name of the exact act, but I know common sense was a part of it. Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party had this ad that they put out. And I remember talking about it on my radio show. One of the things they had put in the ad was a picture saying that if the Conservatives had their way, people would be able to legally bring their AR-15 to a sports field and a shopping mall and all these other places. And they were trying to capitalize off of people's fear because most people, and I would easily put the mayor of Hamilton in this category, don't even know the laws of the country, let alone new laws that are coming in on firearms. And every PAL holder, that's a firearms license, every PAL holder I've ever met has been a responsible person. That isn't to say that some of them shouldn't have a license, but it's not a lifelong permit. It expires every 5 years. But everyone that I've ever met is more knowledgeable on firearms laws in this country than I'd argue most police officers are. Simply because responsible law-abiding gun owners have more of a vested interest in making sure that they follow the law than any other person does. So when we look at this absurd belief that a city could ban guns, I find it hilarious that Hamilton is not even looking at this from a perspective of practicality. They're asking about the constitutionality. Can we legally do this? I'd like to hear how you're going to do it. Forget the legality. Let's say that the Constitution was on your side, which I would venture a guess to say it isn't. What the heck are you going to do to make sure that guns are not in your cities? You know, I mentioned having driven through Hamilton a couple of times. Not once have I ever been stuck at a border there. Not once have I ever had to go through a checkpoint. I'm not sure you have people saying anything to declare on your way down the 403 in Ontario. So you can't keep guns out of the city, even if you could snap your fingers and say every gun in Hamilton has now evaporated to dust. You cannot do anything to prevent people from Burlington, people from Brantford, people from Toronto, people from Niagara Falls, people from Waterdown, people from cities even 5 minutes away from the borders of Hamilton from bringing their guns into the city. So why bother? Is it a bold, defiant stand saying, I dislike guns? Well, no, you actually dislike murder. You dislike gangs. You dislike threats. You dislike violence. These are all things I dislike as well. But why take it out on guns? Why take it out on a tool? You know, I'm from London, Ontario. I live in London, Ontario, and in the last week there have been 2 stabbings. One of them killed a 23-year-old in downtown London last weekend. One of them was actually a stabbing of a 5-year-old girl by her own father, allegedly, who was charged with 1 count of attempted murder. And without getting into the details of that case, I'd venture a guess to say that statistically in London this year, you're more likely to be harmed by a knife than a gun. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have guns in the city. I myself own a gun. I know many people that own guns. I know someone that probably owns enough guns to declare war on Estonia if he really wanted to. But he's no threat to anyone because he, as an individual, has not decided to use his guns for evil. And it's no surprise because the left revels in denying people the right to choose things for themselves. The left loves denying personal responsibility of themselves as individuals and of others. I'll spend your money because I'll do it better than you. I'll decide what foods you want to eat because I'll do it better than you. This is the leftist lawmaker mentality. So it stands to reason that that same attitude applies to guns. I don't trust you to own a gun, therefore I do not let you have a gun. I do not trust you to make a choice as to what you do with a gun, therefore I'm going to take away your choice and take away your gun in one foul swoop. It's kind of laughable to me, actually. I don't know much about Fred Eisenberger. For all I know, he ran on the most fiscally conservative platform at all. But at the end of the day, he is a leftist. If he's trying to, as a knee-jerk reaction to something that happened in his city, try to get out in front of this by saying, I'm going to ban guns. And it's not new. Olivia Chow came out, and thank goodness she lost the election, but Olivia Chow said she wanted to explore something like a ban on guns in Toronto. David Miller, same thing. And what's fascinating about David Miller is that David Miller is a classic example, well, of many things, but of the things that I could say publicly. He is a classic example of how ignorance is bliss for a lot of the anti-gun individuals. You see, Union Station, many people don't know this, for years and years and years, decades as a matter of fact, Union Station, the big train station in Toronto, if you take a train to the big city, this is where you're going. Union Station was home to one of Canada's oldest gun clubs. Seriously, one of Canada's oldest gun clubs. A gun range was inside Union Station all day, every day for years. There were people walking through the concourse with their cases filled with their Berettas, their Rugers, their Brownings, their Winchesters, their Remingtons, and no one got injured. No one was shot. As a matter of fact, if anyone tried to do anything violent at the Eaton Centre, I'd venture a guess to say there were a couple of seasoned sport shooters in there that could have assembled and loaded their gun in only a few seconds and saved some lives. But David Miller, when he found out about this, despite the fact that it had been operating in Toronto for so long as a matter of fact, he had to end it. He had to end it. And this was in Miller's second term when he was campaigning to ban handguns. He had City Council amend a zoning bylaw to limit guns and gun activities away from city property. And then you have the Union Station Club that ends up getting screwed, shutting down despite the fact that they were an icon, not only in Canada's gun community, but in Toronto's community at large. Gone. History gone because of a fear that seems to dominate the left, that because they can't get over it, somehow it becomes everyone else's problem. And it's so sickening. And we look at the stats that say, first off, that gun bans do not work. Never have and never will. There was a famous study going back, I think it was in the late 90s, it might have been even the 2000s, by Professor John Lott looking at this. And I've had the opportunity to interview John Lott on a couple of occasions. But then we even had more recently a 30-year study published just last year, as a matter of fact, saying that states that allow concealed carry have fewer gun murders. And it's not even that gun control doesn't work, it's that it actually has the opposite of its intended effect. The study, which was published in Applied Economics Letters, was looking at determining the effects of state-level assault weapons bans and concealed carry weapons laws on state murder rates. They looked at data from 1980 to 2009 and said this, quote, using data for the period 1980 to 2009 and controlling for state and year fixed effects, the results of the present study suggest that states with restrictions on the carrying of concealed weapons had higher gun-related murder rates than other states. It was also found that assault weapons bans did not significantly affect murder rates at the state level. These results suggest that restrictive concealed weapons laws may cause an increase in gun-related murders at the state level. But that doesn't matter because they make people feel safer. And as we know, feelings matter so much more than facts. We're going to be talking about some of those hurt feelings when we come back in just a couple of moments. People that take a toy weapon and apply the same fear that they have for a real gun. That's coming up on Lawton Online in just a couple of moments. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the Rebel.media.
Welcome back to Lawton Online on the Rebel.media. You know, I was talking in the last segment about guns and the left being scared of them. I mean, there's no other way to put it. They're the fraidy cats. That's what the left is on the gun issue. They don't dislike guns because of statistics. They dislike guns because they don't like them. And that's fine. You don't have to like guns. There are lots of things I don't like. That doesn't mean that I think other people shouldn't be entitled to partake in that lifestyle. I'm rather annoyed by liberals myself, but I mean, you have a right to be a liberal. That's fine. So then we have that fear getting a little bit out of hand in a lot of ways when we're going after anything that just reminds people of guns. Wanted to talk about two stories this segment. One of them is, well, they're both related, but one of them is about Boy Scouts of America. The other is about a young boy, 9 years old, in the United Kingdom. Both of them are victims of the nanny state. And both of them are victims, I should say, not by the nanny state itself, but the nanny mentality. It's not government that's, well, in one case it is, telling them all the things they're doing wrong. In the case of the Boy Scouts story, it's about a ban on water gun fights and a limitation on the use of water balloons. Now, it's not because, we have to save the planet and water's precious and sacred and it's an endangered species, all that fun stuff. Yes, water is an endangered species. There. You heard it here first. No, it's banning water guns because, I kid you not, it is never... You sit down for this one, by the way. According to the Boy Scouts of America, it is not, quote, kind, unquote. Yes, not kind, because it is pointing a firearm. So they've said water gun fights are banned. Now, there's a bit of good news on the horizon. Water guns are not banned. Water guns have not been outlawed by Boy Scouts of America in the 2015 Boy Scout Handbook. What has been banned is pointing a water gun at anything other than a target. Now, unless you are at an amusement park and you're trying to point the stream of water at the hole so that you can get your thing up the hill first and win the rubber ducky or whatever you win at a midway ride, I don't get why you would ever point a water gun at anything that is not a person. Is that not the point of a water gun? You shoot it at a person, you get wet, you have fun. It's like you have a swimming pool without you having to dive in. That's what a water gun is. Now, when I was in Cubs and Scouts and Beavers, we never had the opportunity to have a water gun fight, but we did have the occasional water balloon fight. Unfortunately, those too are limited. Now, they simulate hand grenades, I'm assuming, although I haven't seen that exact quote in the handbook for Boy Scouts of America. But despite the fact that warm weather is approaching at a rather quick pace, the new restrictions on water balloons say that you can only use small and biodegradable water balloons, and you can only fill them with enough water so that they are the size of a ping pong ball. Now, I want you to take whatever hand is free right now and make a shape of a ping pong ball in your hand. I'm doing this right now with my left hand. So I'm roughly cupping it around what a ping pong ball would be. Now, I think we're looking at about a tablespoon of water here, first off. And secondly, I'm not a physicist by any stretch. I don't understand how a water balloon functionally works if you break it down to a scientific level with proportions and velocity and trajectory and all that stuff. But I've always just taken the assumption in my myriad water balloon fights over my years on this earth. I thought the more you fill it, the better it has a chance of actually exploding. Is there not something to do with the weakness of the balloon the balloon gets weaker the more water is in it? So I don't know, when you fill a balloon with a tablespoon of water, if that thing is ever going to pop. I think you might as well actually just be tossing around a golf ball. Except, no, a golf ball is too hard. Someone could get hurt. Because also, you guessed it, a water balloon is not kind. And, of course, they have to be biodegradable, right? The environmentalism and the gun hatred and fear has gotten a hold of even the Boy Scouts, which once used to be, I think, a bastion of independence and survivalism. And I would love it for, would-be survivalists to have gone through the Scouts and, well, I don't really know how to do this because the only knife I'm allowed to use is one that was made with, fair trade, free range steel, none of this, synthetic stuff made in China because they're not good on human rights. And, well, so I guess I don't have a knife at all. I just have to talk nice to anyone who's trying to attack me. Sorry, Bear. I'm here and I'm a nice Boy Scout. Now, if you engage in a consensual water gun fight, not that I think we need to talk about informed consent when we're looking at water balloons, but in the case of a one-on-one consensual water gun fight, I'm pretty sure there's nothing unkind about that. A water gun, water balloon, doesn't matter to me. This is, or was anyway, fun at one point in history. You're going to have like grandfathers rolling in their rocking chairs back and forth and kids saying, "Grandpa, tell me about that time you used to be able to use the super soaker." And it'll be like hearing a war story now with the direction they're going. Which brings us to the case of Kyron Bradley, a 9-year-old London, England boy. He attends a St. George's Brickley School in Bromley, a neighborhood of London. And his mother and he got a visit from the police because of his behavior. Yes, now what terrible behavior did little Kyron Bradley commit? Well, he was waving around a ruler when he played with two friends at his school, pretending it was a sword. I don't know what weapons, if any, or fake weapons his classmates had, but they were playing a game called, and I've never heard of this, Knights and Dragons. Knights and Dragons. So this actually sounds like a good game for the imagination. Maybe it's inspired by Game of Thrones. Maybe it's inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe it is instead inspired by some Disney movie or by Shrek. I don't know. I don't particularly care. As long as they were having fun. Now, I'm assuming we're dealing with a standard issue 30-centimeter ruler here. That was at least the picture the Daily Mail had, so I'm assuming that's somewhat accurate. It's not even like it's one of those old wooden meter sticks with, the slivers pointing out of it. Those things could probably hurt someone if you really tried. But police officers came to the school to speak to this boy. His mother is convinced that he had been doing what boys do. It was play sword fighting. And what seems so disgusting about this is that they didn't even go through what I think would be normal channels, even if this was something that the school decided they wanted to forbid. Why not just say, hey, we don't do that here? I still would have disagreed with it, but at least it wouldn't have been such an overreach by the state here. And this is what I meant earlier when I said there was a case where it was actually the state intervening. The police have no business telling any boy they can't play with a ruler. And this is something that would only happen in Europe, you think. But give it time. Give it time. Heck, there was a case in, I think it was Kitchener, Ontario, just last year, maybe 2 years ago, where a father was questioned by police, put in handcuffs even, because his daughter drew a picture of a gun at school. Now, obviously, then you had this guise of it being a public safety issue and them trying to look out for the kid, but it's this fear, this knee-jerk reaction that seems to dominate. And this is even more dramatic and more of a parody of itself here. Who's harmed by 3 kids playing, fake weapons or no? I have a feeling that it wouldn't have made a difference, even if they had been using imaginary and invisible swords. I have a feeling that it wouldn't have made a difference. When you have Boy Scouts, a legendary institution founded by Lord Baden-Powell over 100 years ago, when you have an organization like that that is saying it's unkind to have a water gun fight, there's not really much left you can do to make this worse. Well, I shouldn't say that. No, every time you say that, people will find a way to make it worse. So erase that, scratch it from the record, never happened. But what is the end game here? Do we want to pretend that violence doesn't exist? I got to tell you a little story here. On Saturday, I went to Canada's Wonderland, which, if you're not from Ontario, is this a huge theme park near Toronto. And it was lots of fun, went on lots of rides, had a blast, had a ball. But I took a break from the hot sun at one point and popped into the arcade. Now, I wasn't going to play any games. I just wanted to look around, see what was there, get a little bit of a cool-down period in an air-conditioned environment. And I'm actually going to look at the picture and describe it to you here because I was in hysterics when I saw this. They had a video game that I had never seen before called Safari Ranger. It was bright, it was lit up, it was big, it had lots of moving buttons and parts and all that fun stuff. Now, I want you to visualize an arcade. What kind of games do you see? You get your classics, your whack-a-mole, and you shoot the basketball in the hoop, and you get your foosball, and you get your air hockey and all that fun stuff. And then you get your Duck Hunter, your military commando games, your car racing games. These, I'm assuming, are all pretty standard video game fare. It's come a long way since Pac-Man. Well, Safari Ranger is a game like no other. Have you heard of Deer Hunter? Have you heard of, Bear Hunter? Have you heard of all of these wilderness hunting games? Well, Safari Ranger is the greatest one of all. You have to rescue endangered species for points. And if you do, you win a safari bonus. I know. Don't tell your kids. They'll make you take them to Canada's Wonderland. Yes, you have to rescue the white lion to win a safari bonus. And you have to drive around on a little cart. You have to throw a rope out to the animals and pull them in and protect them from poachers. And you have elephants and zebras and rhinoceros. This is a real game. This is a real game. And this is, by the way, being geared towards adolescents here. This is not like a 4 or 5-year-old game. The white lion, if you rescue him, you get the most points. But this is a game based on animal rescue. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But when you look at it in the context of other changes that are happening, when you look at it into the context of this belief, and we were talking about this a few episodes ago, by the way, that guns are evil, violence are evil, context doesn't matter, we hate it all. Remember, recently on a podcast, we were talking about the disarmament of Navy cadets. Obviously a younger group, they use ceremonial rifles in their drills, but in Canada, they've now determined that is not allowed. And then you have another topic that came up on the show not long ago, which was military groups in the U.S., specifically younger training program, having their people wear red high-heeled shoes, this weird feminization of the U.S. Armed Forces. Or a division of it. It was for charity, yes, but still part and parcel of this trend that apparently has military having to look less manly and more feminine in order to be more palatable. And you take that, which is obviously a very specific element of this, but it's part of the broader problem, which is this rounding of the edges of everything in society, but we're not even taking away genuine threats. We're taking away things that could be perceived by someone who doesn't know what they're doing and isn't particularly that good at, life, and kowtowing to their needs. No one in the story in London was genuinely, at least not by any of the reports I've seen, threatened or harmed in any way by Kyron Bradley's ruler. No one whatsoever. And we look at the Boy Scout story as well. There's not even been some massive lawsuit stemming from someone getting a stream of water in their eye or having a piece of, balloon in their hair from a raucous water balloon fight. So it's not even like this is a byproduct of litigiousness. This is a byproduct of political correctness. And if you look at the comments that have been directed towards Boy Scouts of America, they're not kind. This is starting out in Michigan. A spokesperson said, quote, "We can understand some may feel that this ban is extreme, but preparing young people for life starts in a child's most impressionable years. We are committed to our mission here, statewide, locally, and nationally." Now, I get that. I get that you're committed. I get that you have a mission. I don't get how you think that children's impressionability is somehow harmed by having them have the ability to, have fun. I don't get how a ping pong ball size water balloon is somehow less harmful to their precious, delicate, flowery minds than, a really good baseball-sized one as a minimum. Back when I was younger, I hate sounding like that because I'm not even that old, but I hate sounding like one of those people that, sits on the rocking chair and goes, back in the day. But back in my day, we would in school even. Stand across from each other. You have this big, giant, not a basketball-sized thing, but maybe like a cantaloupe-sized water balloon, and you toss it, 6 inches to the person across from you. Then you'd each step a few, an inch back or 6 inches back, and you toss it back and forth, and you go back a foot, you go back another foot. At the end of the day, you're, 10 feet away from each other. You're throwing this thing back, and one of you is going to drop it and get wet, and you hope it's not you. And, I remember these things, but not in a post-traumatic way. They didn't scar me. I was shot by more water guns than I can count. Well, it was the same gun, just many times. And my brother was a pretty good shot. And I'm not scarred by that. I mean, if you live in Ontario now, you probably can't afford to, fill the thing with your water tank. But I don't see how there's anything scarring to this. I don't see how it's even unkind. To me, what's unkind, if we want to use such trite language here, is denying kids the right to be kids. It's not even a boys will be boys thing. This is a kids will be kids thing. And look, I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying we need to start getting kids to be more violent. But when we're trying to dull the edges of perceived violence that is not even real violence, we're not even talking about roughhousing here. We're not even talking about anything that's actually caused injury. Not that I've seen anyway. We're talking about banning ruler swords and role-playing when, let's face it, kids are, in this case, being imaginative. They're playing outside. They're having fun. They're doing what more parents should be encouraging their kids to do as opposed to sitting inside and playing video games, like Safari Ranger. And then you have the Boy Scouts thing, same example there. You're looking at something that kids were doing outside, in the sun, playing around, learning teamwork, coordination, lots of great skill. But apparently it's just too much. We got to take a break here. More of Lawton Online continues in just a couple of moments. When we come back, we'll be talking about an art demonstration that doesn't seem that artistic, as a matter of fact seems libelous. Out of Columbia University, the great mattress dragging of 2015. That's coming up in just a few moments on the Rebel.media. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the Rebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
We're back on Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. I have to be a bit honest with you. I'm not what you'd call a connoisseur of, anything. But especially art. I like some types of art. Like, I like the odd, movie or naughty limerick or perhaps a nice song. But I don't get the whole performance art thing. I don't get the variations of it that we see from time to time. Like Yoko Ono shrieking in an art gallery and people going, oh my goodness, that's so moving. It's so beautiful. I don't get the whole Shia LaBeouf sitting in a room thing. I don't get this one display. It's actually like a traveling exhibit where a woman sets up her messy bedroom and people go and look at it and she hasn't cleaned the sheets in, 3 years or whatever. Whatever the case is, I don't really get these things. I think some people like to call stuff art when I'm not necessarily sure that fits the bill. A protest, absolutely. Protest away. And that seems to be the distinction that few in the mainstream media, actually none in the mainstream media, are making about a so-called work of endurance performance art. I didn't know this was a thing, but endurance performance art by a woman named Emma Sulkowicz. She's a fourth-year visual arts major at Columbia University. For her thesis, she is partaking in a work that is actually a protest and not an art installation. Maybe she'll get good grades for it. I don't know. She graduated, so I guess it was working in some capacity. What she does is she carries around every time she's on campus a 50-pound, extra-long, dark blue mattress. Now, I've got to give her props. She's a small-build person, or smallly built person anyway. So to carry around 50 pounds whenever you're seen in public on campus is a pretty impressive feat. Maybe she cheats once she's behind closed doors, but still, I give her credit for the physical strength and endurance side of things. It's what this represents that is a bit concerning, though. Because she's trying to protest against Columbia University, against the site of her so-called art exhibit, which she says did not do anything to address an alleged rape, a sexual assault that she claims happened on campus. And it's important to understand that I'm using words like allegedly and reportedly and accusedly, not because I'm trying to cast aspersions on anyone, but because that's all that we're actually dealing with here. We're only dealing with allegations. We're dealing with nothing that has been proven. But she claims that in August of 2012, she was having sex with a man with whom she had had sex on 2 other occasions. And apparently what was a consensual sexual encounter then turned violent. She said that for whatever reason, she had second thoughts in the middle of this encounter, and then it got a bit violent, and then the man, who we'll talk about in a moment, forced himself onto her, forced anal sex onto her, and then left. She reported it to the school 6 months later, actually more than that. The event happened allegedly in August 2012. She reported it in April of 2013. And then in October of 2013, the university inquiry had found the student to be, quote, not responsible. Now, she did not, for almost 2 years, file a police complaint. When police finally did speak to the person, it was the August 2 years after the August when the assault actually occurred. The district attorney's office said they weren't going to be pursuing the case. There was no evidence to suggest any wrongdoing. And also in 2014, Salkowitz filed a 100-page federal complaint against Columbia University and Barnard College. The document said that the universities were in violation of a gender equality law on campuses by their handling of sexual assault complaints. And it was earlier this year that the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights opened investigations into the complaint. So there's been a lot that's happened behind the scenes here, but very little to do with the actual sexual assault. Everything is to do with what she says has been mistreatment by the university itself. Now, I'm not saying that this sexual assault did occur, nor am I saying it didn't occur. All I can go by are the reports. But there are holes in her story that do not exist in the story of the alleged assailant. Now, he granted, not long ago, an exclusive interview with the Daily Beast. And the Daily Beast looked at a couple of details here. The student, actually, who was accused, Paul Nungesser, he's actually trying to sue the university, saying that they're violating his rights by allowing her art display to go on and not shutting it down. And the reason I'm talking about it now is because the project, I think, has met its end. She marched across the stage at her graduation earlier this week carrying the mattress. The university tried to get her to not do it. They sent out a letter saying no one can bring large objects onto the stage. It might have well have said, hey, Emma, you can't bring your mattress on stage. But for whatever the reason, They didn't stop her from going on. She went on stage. The university dean did not shake her hand, although the university said that was an accident. I don't buy that, but whatever. Now, Paul Nungesser here, he was cleared of a rape charge, but has faced trial by media. He's been exonerated in the eyes of the law, but because this has not gone through the law, because this has gone entirely through public opinion, he has still been absolutely vilified. He received a phone call in April of 2013, so months after the sexual encounter, that he didn't even know was an issue, and it was from the campus office tasked with dealing with gender-based and sexual misconduct, because every organization needs an office like that. They asked him to come in. He thought maybe he was a witness. He didn't really think anything of it. He's from Germany. He's a full scholarship student, a smart guy. He shows up. And then he realizes that he's actually the source of the investigation. Now, here's her story. She says, on August 27th, 2012, her and Paul, who had had sex twice, began choking and hitting her. She struggled and screamed in pain while he penetrated her anally. I'm sorry it's so graphic, but this is the detail of the allegation. It took her several months to file a complaint with the university system. Why she did not go to the police, I have no idea. She says she didn't like the investigation and hearing in which she was subjected to what she called clueless and insensitive questions. When his name was made public, which wasn't until she filed a police report last May, so almost a year ago, he still maintained a bit of a low profile. He did an interview with the New York Times, but then only later gave a more full version to thedailybeast.com. So now his story, according to the Daily Beast, has been backed up in part. There's a part of it, though, where it is simply a he said, she said situation. So this is what happened here. In his eyes, they had had a couple of hookups. They decided that they weren't really going to pursue a relationship. But at one time, they were at a party. They were talking. They started making out. She invited him up to her dorm room. Both of them have corroborated that she made the invite. He had had a couple of drinks. They started having sex. Now, according to Emma Salkowitz, the so-called artist of the mattress experiment called Carry That Weight, he raped her, picked up his clothes, and left without a word, leaving her on the bed, stunned and shattered. According to him, they had anal sex still, but they both agreed to it. Then they did other things, and then they fell asleep, and then he woke up in her bed the next morning and went back to his own room while she was sleeping. And here's where it gets a bit tricky, and here's where she becomes less easy to believe. Because for weeks after that, they had a cordial relationship. And he even provided Facebook messages from that month, from the next month, and from the month after that, from August to October, of conversations they had had. And she's confirmed they were authentic. She said she could explain the context, and then she never did. And then there was one where he had messaged her and said that there was a little party in her room and she should come, and then she said yes. And then she said that, I feel like we need to have some real time where we can talk about life and things, because we still haven't really had a Paul Emma chill sesh since summer. Now, I don't know if that's her way of saying, look, we need to talk about what happened, but she sure isn't saying, I don't forgive you for that, or I'm still mad about that, or how dare you talk to me after this, etc. They had lots of conversations. In fact, she even said to him in October, I love you, after she got a birthday greeting. So it seems as though the story that, he did something that was so unambiguously and unequivocally wrong and bad that she couldn't recover falls apart. And I don't want to cast aspersions on her, given things I've seen in other cases, but someone I know very closely, as a matter of fact, became an example of a rape victim by regret rather than a rape victim by actual rape. It was someone who regretted a decision she made, and later, months later, despite having told me about the sexual encounter that she had, months later decided, hey, that was actually rape. That was actually sexual assault. And it doesn't work that way. You can't retroactively withdraw consent, especially when the thing's already happened and the person's not even there. And you can read the whole breakdown of what he said and what she said. But the point is, and here's, I guess, the bigger problem, is that she's staging this art performance, protesting against Columbia, because she said Columbia didn't expel him. Well, in the eyes of the law, he is not guilty of anything. In the eyes of the law, he has done nothing criminally wrong. Even if he did rape her, the university cannot act based on an accusation alone. And that's what she's pushing for, and that's why she has no credibility. Now, I don't know what happened, but I know that the university should not be able to unilaterally act and instead cast a presumption of guilt just because one student is carrying around a bed on her university campus. And we see guilt until proven is innocent, or until innocence is proven, as being the status quo in a lot of these allegations. You're not allowed to question that narrative. And you see it when, for example, the Bill Cosby protests were going on back in the winter. Again, to me, the matter had nothing to do with did Cosby do anything or did he not. The fact is you had people saying, we believe the women, which is inspiring, yes, and moving, yes, that so many people rallied behind them. But what do you expect people to do? How do you expect people to respond about unproven allegations? Yes, there's something to that old saying where there's smoke, there's fire, but when we're looking at this Columbia case, I'm not even sure there's any smoke. It took her 2 years to file a police complaint almost. They turned up no evidence either. Hard evidence produced by the alleged rapist has challenged at least a part of her story, not all of it, but enough of it that you can, I think, ask the legitimate questions of, okay, well, what else is perhaps a little bit factually creative, to put the nicest spin on it I can. But no, you can't have this conversation because rape culture. Rape culture says you can't question a rape. Rape culture says you can't question an alleged sexual assault. I don't know what happened on that night, nor will I ever. All I know is that she's asking for a very, very unreasonable thing here. She's asking for the university to act on her word alone when she's clearly saying, well, we can't believe his word. Well, why should we believe yours then? Coming up in a couple of moments on Lawton Online, going to be talking to Canadian Taxpayers Federation Troy Lanigan about his new book and about the CTF's 25th anniversary. That's coming up in just a couple of moments on the Rebel.media. Stay tuned.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
Thanks for sticking through on Lawton Online up to this point. I've had the opportunity on my radio show, the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980, to talk to a number of representatives from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation over the years. Not just their federal representatives, but also their provincial representatives as well in the province of Ontario, which anyone listening from Ontario knows, or any outside observers know, there are always going to be examples of government waste in the province of Ontario. But even federally, it seems to be something that's migrated to being a place of somewhat unavoidable fate. So I had the opportunity on my show this week, actually, to talk to Troy Lanigan, the president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, about his new book, which is about all of the battles that CTF has waged in the last 25 years of its existence, but also the battles it has planned for the future. The book is called Fighting for Taxpayers, Battles Fought and Battles Ahead. And I wanted to share with you my interview with Troy Lanigan here on the Rebel.media on Lawton Online. Here it is. When you look at 25 years that the organization has been around, there have obviously been victories, but have the big fish really been tackled in terms of government waste, or is it always going to be an ongoing process rather than something that'll be completely conquered?
It'll never be completely conquered. We're always fighting. We're always battling. But I think what's important is that groups like ours are a counterbalance. The inertia in government always is to get bigger. And we're the guys that stand in front of the truck with their hand up and say, stop, enough. One of the stories I tell in the book is from 2006. Our spokesperson at the time is in front of the House of Commons Finance Committee. And he starts talking about areas where government could prioritize, cut its spending. And one MP on the committee, a rookie MP, says, wait, what? I can't believe what I'm hearing. Nobody has come before this committee and said spend less. And his staff had been tracking to date, and he'd been in a number of hearings, over $600 billion in spending requests. The entire federal government was only spending $220 billion that year. So there's always going to be pressure on government to spend more. And groups and voices like ours, which are significantly outnumbered, are important because I think they give the taxpayers some voice, that even though there's a lot of taxpayers, they're outgunned because the special interests that have an incentive to see government get bigger are so well funded, so well organized.
And this is, I think, the biggest priority here for so many special interest groups, is that the special interest group representing, obviously, whatever their interest is, are always looking for something. They're always looking for funding. They're always looking for money, for attention, et cetera. And you're right, that just by the nature of how politics works, the number of people that are going before government saying spend less is by design almost non-existent.
One of the things, in researching for the book, you dig into these things and you don't even realize there are 8,492 lobbyists in Ottawa. That's a 24% increase since 2010. And that doesn't include what's in the provincial capitals and the cities across the country either. And most of these people want something from somebody else. And that's exactly what you're always pushing back against. There's huge demands on the state. There's huge demands on taxpayers' wallets.
Now, obviously, CTF runs not only a great federal division as well, but also in provinces and in regions of Canada, teams that look out for matters like government waste through debt that's rising. There's obviously the iconic debt clock that goes across the provinces, but also across the country. And there are also more issue-based campaigns, like, for example, a giant, however many stories high Mike Duffy doll that I think could barely fit into the CBC studios. I remember hearing a while ago. And then you have other things like, for example, opposing the GST in 1989. So what has been, I think, in your eyes, the biggest accomplishment for CTF, or at least the biggest issue that gained the most traction, even if it politically might not have translated into what you were looking for?
Oh, I think beyond a doubt it was the turnaround in the finances of the country in the mid-1990s. In 1989, we had Axe the tax rallies that people opposed the GST, but we were reacting to a decision that government had already made. And in the mid-90s, when we still had these huge deficits and the government was talking about raising taxes, again, we got in front of that truck, and we organized a big petition drive prior to the 1995 budget, opposing all of the trial balloons for new taxes that had been talked about. We organized a series of rallies that went right across the country, starting out here in British Columbia, and by the time we got to Ontario, I think our biggest was 5,000 plus people in Pickering. And we got that petition of 250,000 signatures on Paul Martin's desk before the 1995 budget. And it was Paul Martin, a Liberal government in Ottawa. It was a Conservative government under Ralph Klein in Alberta. It was an NDP government in Saskatchewan under Roy Romano. The whole mood of the country changed. And, when you look at 2008 and the downturn that occurred, at least federally, we were in a relatively better position than many other countries, not because of the stimulus and all of the stuff the current federal government had done. It's because of the decisions we had made in the mid-1990s by parties of all stripes to start to get our budgets balanced and eventually create the room that allowed us to reduce some taxes in the early 2000s. And, relative to all the G7 nations, those were very prosperous years for our country and its citizens. We're getting off the rails a bit now again, but certainly at that time, when I look back at the contribution this organization has made, and I talk about it quite a bit in the book, I think those were really key times. And again, it wasn't one party or another, it was all parties, and that's why nonpartisanship has been such an important foundation to who we are as an organization.
And that's always been, for me anyway, someone who is ideologically a conservative, but not necessarily a politically conservative with a capital C on the issues, has always enjoyed about the CTF, which is that, look, you're prepared to lob grenades at both sides if they're warranted. And one area where I've especially respected that, and it's something I've done on this show as well, is government advertising. And this is something that is going on right now at the federal and provincial level, where we have in Ontario a Liberal government that's okay with partisan advertising paid for by the government. And then you also have at the federal level the Conservative Party that seems to be going through the same route. I think the latest numbers a couple of weeks ago came out that said something in the range of, I think it was like $52 million in government advertising to promote essentially what is a partisan policy in many cases over a span of a few years. So what do you make of that? I mean, how can people not be just so demoralized when you guys still have enough to do, regardless of whether there's a Liberal or a Conservative in office?
Well, and that's another thing too. Opposition parties often don't blow the whistles on these very things. I mean, they do sometimes. But they all do it. And I mean, that's the frustrating part. And the best you can do, unfortunately, is just get them on the record committed to changing those things or creating rules or regulations around trying to get them to limit some of this wasteful spending. It's not always easy, but hopefully you can embarrass them into compliance. And, I think another thing, blowing the whistle where it was never in the interest of opposition parties is another thing that we've at least tried to do as an organization. Before we came along, no one knew what politicians were paying themselves in pension benefits, for example. We calculated that. We released it to the public. We demanded reform. And in the case of the federal parliamentary pension, it took 20 bloody years of calculating these things and releasing it. But eventually they collapsed. And importantly, people will say to me, oh, that's just symbolic. That's peanuts. But how can you deal with the bigger issues? The federal government employees were running a $272 billion unfunded liability. You can't address that stuff if you yourself, the people that are making decisions to reform that, are waddling in a pension plan that would make an Arab sheik blush, right? So oftentimes blowing the whistle where the opposition parties won't, and sometimes having to embarrass them, whether it's government advertising or pensions, to make these changes. And it sometimes takes a long time, but I think persistence and having a voice like yours, like many commentators across the country, groups like ours, we're up against big odds, but it's an important fight. Government takes 43% of our income. I say put a fork in us. It doesn't matter what part of the country you're
What's
from.
interesting, though, Troy, is that in some cases you're, that buzzing fly in the ear of politicians, a minor annoyance, but not a huge inconvenience. I'm sure you encounter some politicians that are receptive to your cause. And then you have what happened not long ago in Alberta, for example, when someone who's actually now an MLA in Alberta, just as of a couple of weeks ago, but formerly Alberta director for your organization, actually blocked from entering the budget lockup because apparently you're doing such a good job at criticizing the waste in the then PC government. So you've had obviously examples like that are a little bit more dramatic, but for the most part, how has the reception been? Have politicians tried to discredit you? Have they tried to ignore you? Or have you maybe met some unlikely allies in government?
Yeah. Look, I just think you work hard and they can't ignore you. They may not like your message. I mean, we've been blocked by many hearings over the years. One of the first stunts we ever did was way back, I forget the bill's name, C-85, pension reform back in 1995. And the parliamentary committee at the time wouldn't let us in. So we thought, you know what, we're going to do something crazy, get some pigs on the back of a flatbed truck and roll down Wellington Street with a bullhorn and everything else and make a bunch of noise. And we contacted the Ontario Hog Producers Association, and they said, no, you know what, we're not going to help you with this because we're tired of having our product associated with politicians. So we went and found these plastic pigs at Canadian Tire, and they had this wonderful smile on their face. And we put 242 of them on the front lawn of the Parliament building, and it was on the front page of the Globe and Mail. It was the first time we as an organization had ever gotten on the front page of a paper like that. And guess what? We got into the hearings. But that's sometimes what you have to do. You have to be creative. You have to be forceful. You have to be unapologetic in your conviction and the message you're getting through. And we've had a lot of talented people over the years I've had the great pleasure of working with that have done that. And in order to make a point, you first got to get people's attention. So, I think that's one thing we've tried to pride ourselves over the years, and then obviously get heard is the next step.
The book is entitled Fighting for Taxpayers, Battles Fought and Battles Ahead. So I guess the final question I'd ask you, what are the battles ahead, either ones that are underway now or just on the horizon?
Well, that's a longer longer discussion, but in my view, and I put the disclaimer in. It's I write this book on my behalf. Is that I think debt is the single biggest issue. I know that a lot is made of us being relatively better off than many countries, but when you take into account all of government agencies and entities, including our provinces, do you know, Andrew, we spend in this country $169 million a day on interest payments on debt. That's more than we spend on all kindergarten through post-secondary education in Canada. That's not right. We got to change that. And as our population ages, and we're going to see more upward pressure on things like seniors' benefits and especially health care, we got to get our budgets balanced, because these other problems that are creeping up, and they're happening now when you look at the rationing and the pressures on the health care system, we got to get that together. And any talk in this federal election about stimulus spending is just at the height of irresponsibility. So you'll be hearing more about that from our group, but it's certainly one of the big points I emphasize in this book. And that is taxes, because that is deferred taxes. And we've got to get our house in order on this stuff, because what we're leaving the next generation, what's coming down the pipe, is very serious indeed.
That was Canadian Taxpayers Federation President Troy Lanigan here on Lawton Online, courtesy of AM 980. We have to take a little bit of a break here, but the final wrap-up of Lawton Online comes in just a couple of moments on therebel.media. Stay with us.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
You heard the man. It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, scouring every corner of the globe from Kentucky to Kuwait, finding stories so outrageous there must be a liberal involved. Today we go, like usual, really, no further than Florida, where a man has been arrested after a break-and-enter felony burglary of an occupied dwelling. Timothy Bontrager of Sarasota, Florida, was arrested after a homeowner called the police after he was discovered in her home. She woke up at around 7:20 a.m., went to her living room, found him not stealing from her, but found him sleeping on her couch. She asked him what he was doing in her house. He apologized. She called police. He left the home, but then she noticed that her wallet, driver's license, credit cards, and personal checks were missing. They were recovered on Mr. Bontrager when the police found him walking on a nearby country road. He was later transported to the Sarasota County Jail. I think it's safe to say when you rob a house and you can't even have a big enough cup of coffee that you don't have to take a nap on your victim's couch, I think it's safe to say you must be a liberal. There's no other explanation. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to give a big thanks to all who tuned in and listened in. We have a great edition of Lawton Online next week with a very special guest you won't want to miss. I'll tell you a little bit next week. If you follow me on Twitter, @AndrewLawton, you might see an announcement before then, but I don't want to give it away just yet. But that'll be next week on therebel.media, where Lawton Online is every Thursday. We'll talk to you soon. I'm Andrew Lawton. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out the rebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.